Hello and welcome to another lecture in the Abra Linha ao Vivo series. Abra Linha ao Vivo is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. The purpose of this series is to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussion on the most diverse topics related to the study of human language. Today, I'd like to introduce Cedric Boeckx. He's a researcher professor at the ICREA and the principal investigator of the Cognitive Biology of Language Research Group at the University of Barcelona. Today, Professor Boeckx is going to present a lecture entitled Language Evolution, Pluralism instead of Minimalism. Please join me and welcome Professor Cedric Boeckx.
Hi, thanks everyone. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. All right, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you very much indeed for this invitation and the opportunity to be part of this wonderful series. I have to congratulate everyone who is behind this effort to spread the news about the language sciences in a remarkable fashion. And I would encourage you to continue doing that by also opening this series to junior researchers and junior PIs so that their voices can also be heard. So I'll be talking about language evolution, as the title suggests. I will not spend too much time on the contrast that's part of the subtitle. It will often remain in the background of the slides. I've decided to actually focus more on the positive aspects offered by pluralism rather than the less productive aspects that come together with minimalism. So here are the goals of this talk. I have three main objectives for you today. One, of course, is perhaps the most important one, is to convey the enthusiasm and optimism that I feel for the whole field of language evolution. Second is to take a good look and give you an overview of some of the complexities and difficulties that are associated with examining and asking questions about language evolution. It is a difficult topic. And then the third objective is to provide you with some illustrations of things that one can do, things that in part I have been involved in, where I will emphasize the concept of homology, and specifically two axes of homology that will be important for some of the claims that I'll be making. So you'll see exactly what I mean by axes of homology shortly. So the reason I'm optimistic about the field is I'm actually able and fortunate to be able to build on the work of many excellent researchers and who've helped me understand this topic. And you have a short list of these right in front of you right now. So thanks to all of them, you will see that their works will figure prominently in some cases in some of the slides that follow. And I'd like to start with what I think a novice thinks about the field of language evolution. I think until recently, it was fairly common to believe that the field of language evolution is pretty much a discussion like the one that Lewis Carroll imagined for Alice and the Red Queen, where Alice says that there's no point trying, that you cannot believe impossible things. And the Red Queen replies that, with enough practice, you can actually come up with 6 impossible things before breakfast. In the field of language evolution, until some point, was really like that, where you had a group of individuals telling you that it was hopeless, then you couldn't say much or anything about language evolution. And then another group actually coming up with lots of speculations before or after breakfast, but theories that were hard to test. And ironically, sometimes these two groups were populated by the very same people. So it wasn't rare until recently to hear individuals telling you that it's impossible to say something sensible about language evolution while they were writing books about, for example, it's really only us that have evolved language. So here is a set of quotes that illustrates this. So around a decade ago, it was not rare to hear Noam Chomsky say things like the field of language evolution research is a burgeoning literature, most of which is nonsense, or it's a topic no one understands. And more recently, in lectures, it's possible to find quotes by Chomsky saying that this belief that you cannot say anything sensible about language evolution may actually be inappropriate. There are reasons for less pessimism or more optimism in this domain. And that's certainly a feeling that I share. Unfortunately, it's not a conclusion that I've reached for the very same reasons I suspect Chomsky reached that conclusion. I think he believes that his approach to language, namely the Minimalist Program, has helped shed light on language evolution. I think that's incorrect. I think instead what's changed, the main reasons for being optimistic, is that the facts have changed. So it's not the theories as such that have changed, but I think the facts have changed. And as John Maynard Keynes supposedly said, when the facts change, the thing one should do is change one's mind. And that's, I think, what many people have done in the context of language evolution. People have come to realize that it can be a field that's dominated by optimism, but one that's not dominated by speculations based on theories of language. And to illustrate this further, here's a cartoon that I borrowed from my friend Dan Dediu's website, illustrating a basic contrast in the field when it comes to figuring out when language may have actually emerged, like modern language, if you want, or the modern language faculty more accurately. And you see a contrast on the right between a theory that thinks that, it was sudden, it was recent, it was, say, in the last 60,000 years or so, and it's only, restricted to our lineage, the sapiens lineage. Whereas the other theory that's illustrated on the left, one that actually Dan Dediu has pursued in interesting ways, suggests that the so-called modern language faculty goes way further back in time and was in fact shared with perhaps our closest extinct relatives, the Neanderthals, for example. Right? And this basic cartoon still animates interesting discussions in the field, but I think it's time to retire that cartoon a bit. The reason for this is that it's now very clear, and we have almost on a daily basis new evidence showing that the cartoon that I showed you on the previous slide is really that. It's really a cartoon when it comes to drawing an accurate phylogeny of Homo sapiens. You get something like what you see on this slide on the right, borrowed from I think a tweet by John Hawkes, where there's been massive amount of interbreeding, massive amount of fusion, fission, lots of time for our lineage to actually evolve, not just 70,000 years or so. And so it's really much, much harder, and I'd say impossible, to specify a particular point in time where, it would be only us that could develop the modern language faculty. I think that claim has become hopeless, not for theoretical or conceptual reasons, but primarily for empirical reasons. And so it's still very saddening to encounter quotes like the one that I'm showing you right now. It's taken from two linguists that pursue the minimalist program in various ways, Artemis Alexiadou and Uli Zarland, who repeat a quote that you can actually find in several minimalist papers, typically in the very beginning of those papers, where they tell you that the minimalist program seeks to solve a particularly important puzzle for language, namely trying to understand how a complex system like the modern language faculty could have evolved in our species in a very brief amount of time. And, if you've read Berwick and Chomsky's book, Why Only Us, you know that this is basically a description of what they are trying to do. And I think that this quote is no longer appropriate. It's so detached from the factual basis that we currently have that we can no longer entertain very seriously the claim that the modern language faculty emerged suddenly in the last 100,000 years or so. I mean, that's just, I think, factually something that certainly shouldn't be the default assumption. It shouldn't be the things that you start off with. It shouldn't be the thing you're trying to explain. And to the extent that minimalism is still trying to explain that, I think it just gets the facts wrong. And as a result, we can safely put it aside. And I believe that this may explain why I detect a certain consensus that this minimalist program has come to an end, and it's proven relatively unproductive or infertile. And perhaps the same thing has happened in the context of language acquisition as well, because this quote by Alexiadou and Zarland on language evolution is very reminiscent of claims that you heard in the 80s about Plato's problem, the logical problem of language acquisition, where people would tell you that, look, there's so much that a kid comes to know so quickly, so early in development, that we must have a rich universal grammar to help them get started, right? And now we've come to realize that the stimulus is actually richer than we thought, that it takes a longer period of time for certain constructions in language to be acquired. And so this emphasis on a very rich linguistic knowledge unique to us, arising in a very short period of time, both in terms of evolution and in terms of development, I think can no longer be the default stance in the language sciences. And certainly in the context of language evolution, most of the interesting proposals that I know don't take the starting assumption that Alexiadou and Zarland put in this quote. And so this is why I think, to the extent that the minimalist program is seen as the theory solving this particularly prominent problem, I think the minimalist program is just a program that's expired, as it were. Right. Instead, what we have is a gradual replacement in the field of a movement from just so stories to how so stories. Accounts, some of which I hope to at least give you a taste of in this talk, where we have an approach that relies on what Simon Kirby has called control hypothesis testing through experimentation, approaches that rely on multiple disciplines, not just linguistics, not disregarding the important insights you can gain from adjacent fields, and a science that's actually, I believe, cumulative, one that builds on each other's proposals to refine our understanding of language evolution, and stays away from speculations that used to be perhaps more popular in the past. Well, actually, in the case of minimalism, they are still prominent. These approaches, collectively speaking, I think, do one important thing that perhaps this is an important message that I want to keep with you until the end of the talk and afterwards. It relies on a claim that Darwin already made, that this thing that we called language, or the language faculty, is really a biocultural hybrid, one that certainly consists of two notions that were particularly well captured in a very important paper by Jim Herford that's quoted at the bottom of this slide. Title of that paper is Nativist and Functional Explanations in Language Acquisition. I strongly urge you to read that paper. I wish I had read it much earlier than I did. It would have changed my worldview about language much faster. What Jim Herford does in that paper is actually, instead of contrasting different approaches, he said that in addition to the language acquisition device, that was a concept that he thought was already well known back then, one must also take into account what he called the arena of use, and complement whatever one says about the language acquisition device to the context in which language is put to use. And I think this complementarity is extremely useful in the context of language evolution studies. It's actually extremely important to bear in mind that even if you focus on one aspect or the other aspect, whatever account you provide will depend in part on claims made about the arena of use or the language acquisition device. There is a remarkable and necessary interdependency between these two concepts that actually should foster a lot more collaborations across traditions in linguistics, in my view, because the insights that Jim Herford expressed in this chapter is that you need all the approaches to actually do justice to the biocultural hybridness or hybridity of what actually language is. And so even if you are interested in structure or syntax, like I am, it's very important to bear in mind that this structure doesn't or didn't emerge in a vacuum, that usage matters, that the learning and communicative context matters. And thanks to that context, structure can actually be seen as an emergent property and be understood, I think, in very interesting ways. You only have like two important papers that help me understand this message. One is by Simon Kirby and colleagues, the other is by Limor Raviv and colleagues, and both of them make this point particularly well and saliently, that that the context of acquisition, of learning and use enables you to understand structure and structure emergence revolution in novel ways. At the same time, they know that you need preconditions for this context to be of any use, right? So James Thomas, in a very important thesis at the University of Edinburgh a few years ago, and Bill Thompson and colleagues in a PNAS paper, again, a couple of years ago, have rightly insisted that in order for this context of acquisition and use to be, to play its role, you need to couple that with cognitive biases, but importantly with cognitive biases that are of course biologically grounded, but not to be understood in the traditional UG sense, like specific to that domain, unique to humans, but rather as weak cognitive biases that come into their own and gain their full strength only when placed in a particular context of use. And I think that this is an important message for the whole field, that you need this sort of complementarity between the biological preconditions that will be generic and the context of acquisition and use. Having said this, even if you understand and appreciate this message, it's still very hard to make specific claims about language evolutions and say preconditions. So for example, if I give you this particular tooth that I'm showing you from a Denisovan individual, and I ask you, does this individual have all the preconditions for language? Did he or she have a modern looking language faculty? It's very hard to answer this in a non-speculative fashion. Some people have tried, or at least have taken steps towards trying to answer that question. Here's one paper that I think did things particularly well by David Gockman and colleagues, published in Cell, I think 2 years ago, where they've tried on the basis of genomic information that you could trace back to that tooth that I showed you, try to reconstruct the anatomy of a Denisovan individual. I think this is important because we don't really have certified anatomical fossils for Denisovans apart from a tooth or a bone here and there, but certainly not, say, a cranium of any kind. And so all we have at the highest coverage, as it were, is genomic information. And Gockman and colleagues have taken that information and shown how you could use it to actually reconstruct a fossil that you don't really have, right? And what I just want to convey to you with this slide is how many inferential steps you have to make to get from the genomic information to the reconstructed Denisovan profile that you see at the bottom right. I mean, there's really lots of data involved from genomics, but also lots of theory involved, lots of carefully filtered inferential steps that must come together in order for you to reconstruct what a Denisovan might have looked like. And this could serve as an inspiration for those of us interested in language that doesn't leave fossils, to try to use that massive amount of data, for example, that we have from genetics and genomics, and try to see which are the inferential steps needed to make specific testable claims about whether Denisovan had or not a language faculty. All right. So it's important to combine what's called big data with big theory. And there, I think if there is a message to be had for linguists, theoretical linguists, is that theory still has a role to play. But theory will be blind, as it were, if it's not coupled with the big data that we have, not so much from the traditional linguistics data, but the data coming from adjacent disciplines. And as you do so, I think the method of choice should be one to try to deconvolute or decompose as much as you can. That is, to focus on nuances, because the evolutionary trajectory of language is likely to be complex, likely to be long, likely to be full of turns that were unexpected. And I've just here 2 examples of work that I would recommend to you, showing exactly how this decomposition can help to test certain specific theories, either about language evolution, that's Limon Raviv's thesis, for example, or about the evolution of our lineage, that's Eleanor Sherry's work that shows that simple out of Africa models are hopelessly simple. And this message that Sherry has been making for a couple of years, I think is one that we should really try to assimilate as much as possible in linguistics. What Sherry et al. Have shown is that our species had a very complex evolutionary trajectory in Africa before it moved and colonized the rest of the world. And we should try to do justice to that complex past. And if having language is related in any sense to being human, we should really appreciate how complex being human, being modern human is, and therefore make sure that our theories about human language match that level of complexity. If being human and having language go hand in hand, then you cannot entertain a simple theories for language while others are telling you that being human was a very complex trip already in Africa, let alone once we left Africa. And I think that this is extremely important and does matter for evolutionary cognitive science. So here's an illustration I wanted to give you about the need to decompose. And then I'll give you two case studies that illustrate this a little bit further. It's an excellent article by Kevin Leyland and Amanda Seed on cognitive uniqueness and human cognitive uniqueness. And to cut a long story short, what they end up claiming is the quote that you have at the bottom of the slides, telling you that there are at least three features that underlie humanity's uniqueness, as it were. One is an unusually accurate capacity for imitation. Second, a generalized capacity for teaching and information giving or transmission. And then, so far, I think so good. Then comes, in my view, the killer, where they say the third feature is language, right? And what I find particularly nice and at the same time a bit ironic in this paper is that they spend pretty much the whole paper trying to decompose cognitive uniqueness into manageable components. And when they come up with three features that could actually be the pillars of this cognitive uniqueness, they leave one undecomposed, and that's language. And I think this is where the linguists could actually come in and say, actually, this third feature is actually a complex collection of many features that probably depend on and interact with the two other features that are given in this quote that I just read to you. And so there is a role here for linguists to insist on the need to decompose this notion of language in a way to make testable hypotheses. So, of course, this is a program that started in a certain sense with Hockett's design features. And although his specific list of design features likely needs to be revised, the spirit of it, I think, is still very useful, trying to see what is it that's part of language that we could approach in a productive way in an evolutionary context. And I've given you a list, very tentative list of things that I think belong in there. And some of them I'll try to just look at with you in the rest of the talk. And in order to do so, I will rely on the method of choice in evolutionary biology, which is the comparative method. Darwin pretty much always started his books with the notion of variation and comparison. And in linguistics, I think for too long, certainly in the Chomsky tradition, language was seen as the thing that human language was seen as the thing that you cannot compare to what other species have. It's species unique. It's so radically different that it makes no sense. You can only contrast it with what other species have. And I think that this has really hampered progress in language evolution. It's only in the past decade or so where people have come to realize how powerful and useful the notion of homology, the notion of productive comparison and commonality can be in the context of human language. And I'll rely on, I think, the two, well, certainly to me, the two most productive homologies that have been pursued in the literature. One is vocal learning, which is a trait that's been identified, not in every species out there, but at least in a few species that have been studied extensively and productively, telling us a lot about, human speech and spoken language. And then also the second homology will have to do with social cognition and this umbrella term of self-domestication, which I'm not too fond of, but this idea that looking at the social cognition of other species could actually tell us something interesting about our own. And I'll organize the rest of the discussion along these two axes and tell you that they actually teach you different things about different aspects of language. And the interesting thing as well is that they interact in interesting ways to, I think, essentially give you a wonderful system of communication that we call human language. And before I turn to the next slide, let me just insert a plea that for these two homologies, these two themes, we really need more comparisons than we have. We already have some that's been useful, but we need more and more. So I'm particularly enthusiastic about the fact that lots of people are trying to identify vocal learning in non-canonical vocal learners, right, including primates. I'm also particularly enthusiastic about the fact that people are trying to look at instances of self-domestication outside of us, be it in bonobos or in like Brian Hare has done, or in elephants like Limor Raviv is trying to do right now. I think that we need more and more of this because we just need more data in this to guide our theories. So let me start with this notion of self-domestication, this axis, right? And I'd like you to think of what I'm about to say about self-domestication in terms of Herford's term, the arena of use. I think what self-domestication has done is modify the arena of use, the context in which the thing we call language is actually learned and put to use. And perhaps one way in which I can just lay this out is by going back to an interesting paper by Tom Scott Phillips from 2017, where he showed that in order to understand the evolution of standard components in language like semantics, syntax, morphology, and so on, we should put pragmatics as the basis for this understanding. And I think that there's some insight in there, but I'd like to replace pragmatics with the notion of arena of use and put pragmatics as just another component to be understood in terms of the evolution of this notion of arena of use, this specific ecology that makes human language possible. I prefer the notion of arena of use as a foundation to pragmatics, in part because of data of the sort that Brian Hare and colleagues have been generating in the context of domestication, showing how the domestication process has enhanced the communicative abilities, if you want, the pragmatic abilities of dogs when you compare them with wolves. But this process was not the foundation, was the outcome of the domestication process. It was made possible by a change that's not really communicative in nature, right? And I think this preprint on cooperative communication in dogs illustrate why it is that domestication could be a useful concept to understand this modified arena of use that then helped shape not only syntax, semantics, phonology, and so on, but also pragmatics as well. Right. So in the past 5 years or so, people have examined this concept of self-domestication productively, starting with the parallel that you see on this slide between the anatomy of modern humans and its closest extinct relatives as a proxy for, say, the last common ancestor with the Neanderthal, and dog versus wolves, and shown that, look, we see similarities that might suggest that, as many people had speculated in previous centuries, including Darwin, we may have gone through a process of self-domestication, which essentially amounts to, I think, a reduction of reduced aggression. Right? So this parallelism, to a certain extent, could have been established a long time ago. The reason I think the topic is gathering attention is people have found ways of moving past this initial parallelism and try to test the idea of self-domestication more rigorously. So here's one thing that we did. We took seriously the claim that this change that I showed you on a previous slide, this anatomical change, may be due to changes at the level of the neural crest, the very foundation of the bones of our face, for example. And we have tested this in the lab, looking at the effect of tweaking genes implicated in a neural crest production and migration. This is work that I was fortunate enough to do in collaboration with Giuseppe Testa in his lab, showing that you can actually study the genome-wide effect of a twist on certain genes. In this particular case, we looked at the gene called BAS1B. It's very important which gene it is, and try to see if the effects that we see about genes being upregulated or downregulated by this twist on BAS1B could in any way be detected when we compare the modern human genomes and the archaic genomes, the Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes that we have. And we, I think, suggested that in a certain sense, we saw certain effects that are worth exploring further. Is further exploration of this. You can actually take specific genes implicated in bone formation and test in the lab whether they are overexpressed or underexpressed, depending on whether you take the modern human allele or the archaic allele, and see whether these directional changes could correlate with more or less bone production that eventually you want to bring back to the anatomical cartoon that I showed you a few slides ago. And this is something that you could do in the lab, showing that you can actually go beyond the initial parallelism and show that, yeah, there is some basis for this parallelism at the level of the underlying biology. There's another thing you could do, which we did a few years back, is to actually take the genomes, not only of modern humans and Neanderthals, but also dogs and other domesticates, compare them to their wild counterparts, and looked at regions of their genomes that have been under positive selection, and see if those regions essentially overlap with those regions that have been posited for modern humans. And as you do so, you see that indeed genes falling under those regions have to do with anatomy. That's the good news. But interestingly, they also have to do with genes that have long been implicated in anxiety, in depression, sometimes schizophrenia, genes that you can actually relate to circuits in the brain that essentially make you more or less tame, more or less aggressive, specifically reactive aggressive, right? And this is important, and this came up as a surprise to us when we looked at these regions of selections that overlap and the genes in them. the genes that were overrepresented in those regions were genes that were really implicated not so much in the anatomy, but in those brain circuits controlling fear and fear reaction and this sort of thing. And what's interesting is that this like reduction of reactive aggression is virtually the only thing that all domesticates share. So even though the anatomical parallelism is the driving intuition, it's things at the level of the brain that are actually shared across domesticates. And that's actually quite interesting, because that means, and I'm going to skip a few slides, you can look at, for example, gene receptors implicated in oxytocin and other neurotransmitters. And the picture that you get is one where this change of, from a more reactively aggressive phenotype to a less reactively aggressive phenotype didn't happen suddenly and didn't happen in one step. It most likely took multiple steps to give rise to the behavior and the anatomy that was originally inspired by the cartoon and the parallelism between the dog and the wolf and modern human and archaic human. So here are at least 3 steps that we have argued for in this process of self-domestication. First, a reduced reactive aggression having to do with changes in the limbic system of the brain and the hypothalamus. Then changes in neural crest production and migration affecting essentially craniofacial morphology. And then a further boost in prosociality or friendliness with things like oxytocin and dopamine that I think were important to capture the enhanced communicative cooperation that Brian Hare has identified in his work. And so even though we started with a parallelism that suggested one change, as you see, if you try to examine the underlying biology, you quickly realize that there were multiple steps, multiple mechanisms involved. And I think that this can serve as a lesson for the sort of thing that we can anticipate in the future, that every productive intuition we might have is likely to give rise to a very complex multi-step underlying biology. And I think the important thing in there is not so much to emphasize complexity, but also the fact that there are multiple steps, which means, again, that you will need time, and that anything like this minimalist intuition that it was all sudden and quick and just one thing is absolutely hopeless, I think. And each step likely triggered gradual changes that affected our communicative ability. So changes in our facial anatomy most likely had effects on facial expressions, and subsequent changes involving dopamine and oxytocin led to further complexity, as we have shown looking at bird songs contrasting domesticates and their wild counterparts. So I think it's very important as well to think that all these steps that we are likely to identify will give rise to essentially what could be called stages of proto-language. If you try to reserve the term modern language faculty to the final state, as it were, and then there were many, many steps in between, each one of which influence the communicative and linguistic phenotype of the individuals that were going through these steps. And I think that this means that this notion of proto-language really has to be understood as well as something to decompose into many, many stages with an underlying biology, but also a modified arena of use for each step along the way. All right. So in the last part of the talk, I want to focus on I want to return to the topic of structure. And I want to approach this topic in terms of the sort of mental sequences that we can process and memorize in language, syntax, if you want, although I think semantics would be perhaps just equally appropriate to term. And I want to do this because so far, the changes pertaining to the arena of use that I've discussed in the context of self-domestication, I think don't fully capture the underlying biology that we need in order to account for the sort of mental structures that we can process in language. I think to do that, we must not only look at self-domestication and the craniofacial changes that are reflected in the fossil record, we must also try to reconstruct the ontogeny of the brain that gave rise to the sort of species-typical globular skull that you see here depicted as a continuum on this slide. I think that these brain-related changes cannot be reduced to whatever underlying biology accounts for self-domestication. It's really an additional axis of homology that must be appealed to understand this. And the second axis of homology is vocal learning. And here we have both massive amount of data and massive amount of theories to build on. I recommend the paper by Eric Jarvis published in Science in 2019, showing how the brain circuits that support vocal learning in birds essentially emerged from a process of duplication and divergence from a source that was motoric, but not dedicated to vocalization. So at first you had to develop a motor learning pathway, then essentially get a biological process or processes duplicating this pathway in the brain to then devote that pathway to vocal learning specifically. And this has now been fairly well established in birds. So Eric's paper from, I think, 2008 or so, really did this well down to the molecular level. And there is evidence that something like that may have happened also in our lineage, where we gradually, as it were, recruited a circuit that was originally dedicated to manual dexterity. Right? Now, what's interesting about this circuit is that most researchers have focused on how this circuit could help you understand the control of the laryngeal muscles that are important for vocal production and vocal production learning. But I think there is also an aspect of that circuit that deserves closer attention, which is that as this circuit diverges from the original motor circuit, as it gets duplicated and specialized for the laryngeal motor cortex, as you can see here in various papers and representations cited on this slide. What's interesting is that it also feeds into a particular pattern of connectivity from the prefrontal cortex to something posterior that you can see, for example, here. And this posterior area is essentially, I think, setting up the stage for implicating the what's known as Wernicke's territory. So this is the beginning, I think, of a Broca's region, Wernicke's region dialogue linked by a fiber bundle known as the arcuate fasciculus. And I think that this set the stage for further elaborations in our lineage for vocal learning in a way that have also been perhaps less well, but importantly described by Jarvis and colleagues, this time not in all vocal learning birds, but specifically in parrots. So parrots are known to be extremely proficient vocal imitators. And Eric Jarvis and colleagues have shown that in order to account for this enhanced imitative ability, you need to appeal to another round of duplication and divergence of neural circuit from a core vocal learning pathway to what he called a shell vocal learning pathway that you see here represented on the right. And what's particularly important about this second duplication event is that the connectivity pattern of the shell is distinct from the connectivity pattern of the core. So they don't target exactly the same areas of the brain. And so they can basically gather up new functions. And I think that this is something that the literature on human brain evolution is also converging towards. So this arcuate fasciculus that I mentioned earlier, linking Broca's region and Wernicke's region, is known to consist of separate segments. And Angela Friederici and colleagues have argued that these segments were the results of something like a duplication with different maturational profiles and most likely as well different evolutionary profiles. And I would like to think of these various segments of the arcuate fasciculus that you see represented on this slide in pretty much the same term as the core and shell vocal learning pathway, giving rise to enhanced vocal learning abilities. That means, in my view, enhanced handling of sequence formation. Right? Now, here's very briefly what could have happened in the case of human language with all these duplications. I think these elaborate connections between essentially different sub-areas of Broca's regions and Wernicke's regions gave rise to a brain that's capable, on the one hand, of handling hierarchical sequences, which is extremely important for production. That's handled by essentially the prefrontal cortex, together with other regions of the brain, most posterior regions of the brains that are known to handle recursive hierarchical embedding, not just in language, for example, in vision, they do so as well in the temporal cortex. And combining the abilities of these two regions essentially give you, I think, the best of two abilities, namely you combine hierarchical sets and hierarchical sequences, right? And when you combine these two things, you essentially get representational abilities that were described already very, very early on in theoretical linguistics in the 50s. It's already in syntactic structures, where Chomsky talked of phrase markers and transformational markers. And these are essentially the representational power you need to handle pretty much all that's necessary for syntax. So if I'm right, this would suggest that these elaborations of the vocal learning circuit can be studied in non-human vocal learners. And I think this would be a message that I'd like to convey to you. And it would also suggest, and maybe I'll end on this thought, it would also suggest that on the one hand, vocal learning, and therefore the vocal modality, played a significant role in establishing a connection between areas handling sequences and hierarchical sets. And on the other hand, it also suggests that at the very heart of the representational power that we attribute to syntax to express essentially meaning, we have something that Chomsky likes to call externalization of phonology. That's actually the root of these circuits. It's the root of these representational powers. And so it suggests that you cannot really study syntax and semantics and their underlying biology in isolation of their modes of expressions and their modes of externalization. And so I think this would be a good way to end, because it suggests also that in this respect, minimalism got it wrong, and it got it wrong because it didn't pay enough attention to the power of homologies and the things one can learn by doing comparative biology. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cedric, for this excellent talk. Now we will start with the question and answer session with invited discussant Professor Martin Hasselhoff. Professor Martin Hasselhoff is a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and has already participated in the series Abralinha ao Vivo with the lecture How Evolutionary Adaptation Explains Language Structure. Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to ask some questions. There will probably also be other questions, right? But let me start to thank you for your talk, which had a lot of biology in it that I can't really say anything about because I'm a linguist, like you used to be, a kind of a straight linguist like you used to be in your earlier times. So when you say critical things about minimalist linguistics, then you know, in contrast to all your biologist colleagues, you know what you're talking about. But I was wondering if you aren't judging the minimalist approach a bit too harshly when you say it's no longer productive, it's expired, because I mean, what is its own goal? I mean, Chomsky has not called it theory. In the 1960s, he was sort of ambitious. He sort of even called one of his approaches the standard theory, as in physics. So the minimalist program kind of was meant to be, you know, a program, something to sort of ask questions, and you know, it can't really be falsified in that regard. Now, at one point, you said, when the facts change, one should change one's theory. So my concrete question to you, you know, since you were sort of doing this minimalist syntax earlier too, were there really facts that changed that led you to, you know, look elsewhere? Or was it that your perspective changed, or that you didn't get what you wanted to get from minimalism? Because, I mean, certainly in linguistics, you know, the last 60 years or so, whenever there were changes, it wasn't really in response to facts changing, it seems to me. So in linguists, we kind of keep changing our perspectives. Kind of new perspectives come in, new ways of looking at things. Sometimes phonological ideas have a strong influence on syntax, as with optimality theory and so on. So unfortunately, in linguistics, I don't really see changing facts having a strong influence on changing approaches. And you know, evolution is becoming more and more popular for whatever reason. You know, it's not that we didn't know about evolution, as you know, it was in Darwin, as you noted. So it's, you know, that's kind of some general considerations and questions.
Great question. Actually, great set of themes. I first want to start by thanking you for joining. I mean, you are a linguist that I respect enormously, and so it's a great both pleasure and honor to get questions from you. So I'll try to address some of the topics you raised. This could be a discussion of hours, but let me just say that I don't think I'm too harsh on minimalism for several reasons. It's true that it was advertised as a program back in 92 already now. And to me, a program cannot remain a program unchanged for like 30 plus years if we don't actually see measurable progress, right? And it seemed to me that if you think of the big innovations of that program, for example, the claim that you could reduce everything to merge, right? That's already almost 2 decades old. That's not a good sign for a very productive program, right? So I think that, Chomsky used to say that a program can be fertile, productive. It can also be premature, right? If you see that it doesn't lead to, cumulative progress. And I think at best, the minimalist program has turned out to be premature at best. Certainly now that we have 30 years of it. The second thing that I wanted to say is that you raise another important point about the roles of facts in theory construction. I think that facts should have an important role to play in theory construction, so that if facts do change, theory should respond accordingly. And in the context of evolution, it's true that, in part, it could have become popular for whatever reason. But I think what's one of the things I wanted to convey in this talk, and that I do want to convey, is that the landscape, things that we now understand about the evolution, for example, of Homo sapiens inside Africa or something like that, do lead to the conclusion that traditional scenarios for the evolution of our species were radically oversimplified, right? So the facts no longer match this, right? And when I say facts, I do mean that is until a decade or so ago, we didn't have the genomes of archaic hominins. We also didn't have all the insights from many parts of Africa that were understudied. And now that we are seeing this, it's quite clear that, simplistic phylogenetic trees leading to us just won't work. And I think that this matters for linguistics because, to some extent, I think minimalism is a program that says, look, we had looked now at language acquisition for a couple of decades. We think we have understood enough to consider Plato's problem solved, quote unquote. Now let's turn to what people call Darwin's problem of language evolution. And let's see if the minimalist program, in its underlying simplicity, can actually make sense of human evolution, right? And the modern human language faculty. But by doing so, they essentially adopt an empirical state of affairs that's no longer factually supported. And, it seemed to me that this does matter, that even if it's a program driven by theoretical consideration, it should be responsive to discoveries in other disciplines. And if the other disciplines tell you, look, the story you have to come up with cannot be too simple because that's just not what we see, then I think it really is important to change one's mind, because after all, I still think that linguistics ought to be, and I think you agree, an empirically driven discipline. I mean, theory has an important role to play, but the ultimate judge should be the facts. And I think in this respect, one can be really harsh about minimalism.
One thing that I find really striking is that in the 1970s, 1980s, Chomsky and his followers were emphasizing the sort of rich universal grammar because they wanted to address Plato's problem in this way by saying that, there's sort of a lot of things given also in phonology. There are all these innate features that Chomsky and Hallett talked about in 1968. But nowadays, in the last 15 years or so, Chomsky has said that only very little is given in advance, and a lot is contributed by third factors or something like that. So that was really dramatic shift, which I don't really see motivated by the facts. But let me mention something else, because this developmental perspective, I mean, there's not just Chomsky in linguistics, right? There's a long tradition of evolutionary linguistics, in the sense of linguists studying the diachronic development of languages. This was extremely prestigious in the 19th century, and there were a lot of ideas also throughout the 20th century and then until now about how languages change, and often people try to link language change to the biological evolution in one way or another. You didn't talk so much about this. Also, people then try to link language change to language development in the individual, so language acquisition. So there were various ideas around. And one kind of really interesting challenge now is how we should use the term evolution. So this comes up once in a while also in Twitter discussions and so on, because more and more diachronic linguists realize that diachronic change is a kind of cultural evolutionary process. So in the past, we thought of language change as, well, you know, let's just change, the cultural change. So we didn't call it evolution, but increasingly we see cultural change also as a kind of evolution, and we talk about diachronic language change as diachronic evolution. So we could talk about the evolution of a sound system, for example. I mean, that's kind of purely historical cultural process, but we still call it evolution, and we sometimes use biological methods, phylogenetic algorithms, and so on. So now the question becomes, is the cultural evolution and the biological evolution, is this part of sort of one macro evolutionary process, or is it completely different things that just happen to have the same label? And if they just happen to have the same label, then wouldn't it be better to always say evolution of the biological capacity for language instead of language evolution? Because by using the term language evolution, which you have in your title, you know, then it becomes a bit vague. What do you mean? Do you mean cultural evolution of languages, or do you mean biological evolution? Or maybe do you mean it in some macro general sense?
Great question, great topics as well. Let me, so this last topic on evolution is very important. Let me just quickly go back to the early comment you made about, you know, innateness of a rich universal grammar at the very beginning in the 60s or something. I also see this as a very ironic development, as it were, when for a long period of time people did insist in that particular linguistics tradition that you were referring to, that you really needed such a very rich basis in order to compensate for the you know, the poverty of stimulus, as it were, right? So now I see this as a dramatic loss of explanatory power, that on the one hand, we still insist in that tradition that the poverty of stimulus is indeed present, but we've lost the rich basis that was, you know, there before. And now that's been replaced by magic. Another term is third factor, right? Yeah, this is actually another reason why I think that it's not very productive when you're when your core argument is essentially a synonym of magic, right? So I'll leave it there for people who understand the third factor better than me. But to address the more important point of evolution, it's true that I didn't focus the discussion on this today, although there were parts that are relevant to your question. I do want to use the term language evolution in this vague or ambiguous sense that you mentioned, because I do not see a sharp distinction between the biological aspects and the cultural aspects. So this is the influence of a couple of people on me. It's Jim Herford, it's Simon Kirby, it's Limor Raviv. It's these individuals that have shown me through their work and their colleagues' work that you cannot really separate both. You can, of course, focus on some aspects because you can't do everything in all the studies. But I think a language really is this hybrid thing between, it relies on biological priors or biases that are well worth studying. And it also relies on the context of use, this arena of use, right? And so it crucially relies on this cultural aspect that cannot be ignored, even if you focus on the biological preconditions or biases, because for every claim that you make about the biological preconditions, they have to be checked against what the cultural context can actually give you. And likewise, every claim about the cultural context depends on which priors you actually assume that's provided by your biology. And I think, so this whole tradition, rich tradition that you were alluding to, of diachronic linguistics, of the study of cultural change in languages, can really provide us with lots of tools, even to understand stages of language evolution of this biological process. For example, steps in proto-language, which were also heavily reliant on the context or the arena of use. It was already a cultural hybrid back then. And so this is a tradition that people like me who were not trained in it can actually provide a lot of analytical resources, even when we try to focus on the biological preconditions, because I think there's not a single argument I know of that allows you to neatly separate the biological and the cultural in the context of language at no stage. So it's true, and I think I was guilty of it before, so it wouldn't be hard to go back in the archives and find quotes of mine, I think. I think it is a mistake to think that you can almost time the transition between the biological process and the cultural process. Right? I think that these two are fundamentally intertwined. And so this is where the pluralism that was in the subtitle can be useful, because here were methods that can be that may come from a tradition where culture was the dominant focus, but can be extremely useful in the context of biology. And I think that lots of work presented, for example, at Evolang demonstrates the fruitfulness of this combination of both approaches, I think.
Okay, I have a third question, or maybe there are questions by others, I'm not quite sure.
I don't know how it works.
So yeah, maybe I just go ahead with my third point. I thought it was good that you emphasized homology and comparison. So Darwin kind of always compared things, and so but I think biologists often say that to understand the adaptive significance of a trait, you kind of really have to see it in parallel evolution, and you have to compare different species. So without comparison, it's sort of a bit difficult to see. Now, for many traits in biology, we have a lot of examples. So, you know, the famous example well, actually, what I meant to say is functional analogy. So not homology. So the famous example of wings in bats and birds and pterosaurs. I mean, how analogy relates to homology is still a different question. But let's talk about the functions now and the comparison of different species. So the adaptive value of wings for flying is very clear, also because it recurs in different species, also in insects. And so on, or the adaptive value of eusociality in kind of different insects and other species that live like ants and bees and so on. So, but when there's a trait that's pretty unique, then that's hard. So, you know, understanding the trunk of an elephant is difficult, or understanding the stripes of the zebra is difficult, because other big mammals don't have these. And language also is a challenge. So would you agree that understanding the biological evolution of language is a particularly hard question compared to other evolutionary questions because of its uniqueness? Is that something that sometimes occurs to you? And could it be that uniqueness makes the question a bit too hard?
Okay.
I mean,
good questions again.
With your enthusiasm, and you know, I don't exactly share that, so it's
fair enough. Fair enough. So I do think that the topic of language, of human language evolution, is hard. At times, of course, I think it's too hard, but I think it's a feeling that I get over quickly. But I think it's hard, but not for the reason that you mentioned. So not for uniqueness. I think what makes it hard is because human language consists of many interacting parts, none of which are unique, all of which can be studied in a comparative context in terms of homology. What's, I think, particularly hard is to see how these various axes of homology, can come together uniquely in one species like us. So it's due to its complexity rather than its uniqueness that makes it hard. But I think that in a certain sense, the trunk of an elephant strikes me as more unique than human language is. Because in the context of language, we've actually been able, and what I say we, not me and just a few others, like we collectively as a field, have been able to decompose this this ability into smaller bits that make it more manageable in a comparative context. For example, so I mentioned vocal learning and then maybe social cognition. There are many more parts that I couldn't touch on. And I think what makes it hard is, for example, not so much to find another species that could tell you something about vocal learning or self-domestication. What makes it hard is when you say, but are there other species that are both vocal learning and self-domesticates and a bunch of other things that enter into language? That's where humans kind of stand out, where there are massive collections of subtraits. But I think that on a daily basis, when you try to understand bits of this big puzzle, it's not harder than any other trait that interests a biologist. But of course, it's hard for the linguist, because as you decompose this trait, and as you look at the biological substrate underlying it, it looks less and less linguistic-y, if you want, right? That's the price to pay. I think that it's true that we won't find another linguistic creature exactly like us, but I think every species is unique in their own way, and I think ours is not special in this sense.
Okay, so I think Miguel may have more questions.
I have a couple of questions from the audience, one more general and another one more specific. The first one is, do you think the evolution of vocal learning ability relates to hierarchical sequencing ability, to hierarchical set formation ability, or both?
A good question. I think it depends. It depends on how you understand vocal learning. If you understand vocal learning in the most common sense, the one that you find, for example, in lots of songbirds, where it's less complex than in parrots, then I think it primarily relates to hierarchical sequences. But I think as you move to other instances, more complex instances of vocal learning of the sort you find in parrots, for example, then it could also relate to things like hierarchical sets, especially to understand the connectivity of the circuits that makes this link between hierarchical sequences and hierarchical sets that are so important for human language. So I think vocal learning is not one thing. Unfortunately, it's true for many biological traits. In its simplest definition, it most closely relates to what I called hierarchical sequences. That's correct. Yeah.
And the other one is about, I think that you mentioned, well, it's about the person says some birds are also able to improvise melodies, which should require some hierarchical structures, right?
Yeah, so this is tied to the notion of hierarchical sequences. I think that we have a lot more to learn from the songbirds. Traditionally, I think people thought that songbirds can only tell you about phonology, about simple sequences that you also find in language, but not about the complex ones. I think that's not quite correct. I think that we should expect to learn a lot more from the birds. I think that they will tell us important messages and lessons about complex hierarchical sequences. And at the same time, I think we should also realize that our hierarchical sequences are not all that fancy after all. They are not all that different from those that songbirds are actually producing. So I think two things must happen. We must deflate a bit what humans do and appreciate a bit more what other species do also in the vocal domain.
Okay, once again, thank you very much, Cedric, for joining.
Thank you very much. Thanks to you for the invitation. Thanks, Martin, for joining and for the excellent questions. Bye-bye.